Let's be real here. Listening to an audiobook is not real reading. Letting your ears do the work for you? Ugh. All this newfangled technology is corrupting today's youth and leading to the degradation of our society. Back in my day, I had to use these things called hands to pick up a book and read it with these things called eyes. And only then, after I read all the words on a page, could I say that I read a book. Nowadays, you can slap on some music, go do your chores, come back, and the book's done. There, I read a book. That's the problem with this generation. What next? Am I a chef because I put a TV dinner in a microwave? Am I a rocket scientist because I throw a paper airplane? Am I God because I get to decide whether the ants in the anthill outside my door get to live or die? We were getting a little ridiculous there, weren't we? Well, that is what a lot of the conversation around this topic sounds like to me. But I think there is an important conversation to be had. So bear with me. Semantics do matter, and at the end of the day, that's really what this boils down to. Semantics. You listen to audiobooks and you read physical books. There is a difference semantically, but there is still a difference, even if it really is superficial. Regardless of whether someone listens to an audiobook or reads a physical book, they have still experienced that book. They have still consumed its contents. They still know its story, but in different ways. And that's what this video is going to be about. I want to explore the way each of these methods is different and why I believe what I said, which is that listening to audiobooks is different than reading books. Now, an important caveat to get out of the way is that when a lot of people say that they have read a book, when in reality they've listened to an audiobook, they're using that term colloquially. There are so many different methods to reading a book, whether you read the physical book, you've bought it, you read an ebook, you listen to the audiobook. Collectively, we understand that the colloquial term for doing that action is saying, I've read a book. So when you're conversing with someone and they've listened to an audiobook, but they talk to you and say, hey, I read this book, blah, 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 let's talk about it. You know what they mean. You know that semantically there's a difference, but you don't need to be that dickhead that goes and is like, well, you didn't actually blah, 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 blah. It's a colloquial term. Can we just understand that and kind of move on and not really debate semantically with someone you're just trying to have a conversation with? Come on. That's what videos like these are for, debating semantics. Yeah. So we know what they mean colloquially when people say, I've read a book, even though they could have potentially just listened to the audiobook. Now, there is a sect of, let's say, audiobook haters that don't consider you a real reader if you listen to an audiobook. They either see it as lazy, taking away the effort from reading, seeing it as less intellectual, not something you have to use your brain for. And to that I say, your superiority complex is what is lazy and less intelligent. Now, let's get into the research. Like with most research, it's important to know who is conducting the research and who is funding the research. It's important contextually. It does not invalidate the findings or the factual truthness of the research papers, but it is important to note. It is important not to disregard or disbelieve research just if there's an associated party involved, especially with like medical and health research and other statistics. It's just important to be aware so you can use critical thinking when engaging with certain research across the board. For example, if in this context, if we have some research saying audiobooks are great, everybody loves audiobooks, blah, 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 but it's coming from a audiobook company that would profit from people buying more audiobooks, it's best to, take it with a grain of salt. Again, a study I want to look at: Children, Young People, and Audiobooks Before and During Lockdown by the National Literacy Trust. Couple important takeaways. We see that a lot more people were engaging with audiobooks during lockdown, especially the youth. A little over half say that listening to audiobooks increased their interest in reading. Seems like an interesting thing to note. A third said listening to audiobooks made them feel better, also worthwhile to note. And a thing that will be relevant for a point later is that more boys than girls said they had listened to audiobooks during lockdown, showing that boys are getting an interest in reading. All of these articles will be linked in the description if you would like to read through the full contents yourself. Another point of research, there is a Time article from 2018 written by Markham Heed. Are audiobooks as good for you as reading? Here's what experts say. Goes on to make different points. Points out a 2016 study in which two groups were to engage with a section of a nonfiction book about World War II. One group read the section, another group listened to the section. There was also a third group that both read and listened, and they found that there was no significant difference in the comprehension between any of the groups. Worthwhile to note. Further on in the article, it goes on to say a couple other things. Also pointed out in this article is a 2010 study that focused on groups learning educational material, either via a podcast, so auditory, or through a physical lesson on paper. And it said that the podcast group did a lot worse on a quiz about the material than the people that read. This is more in reference to learning and education, like in a classroom. So it might not directly be related to the nature of physical reading versus listening to audiobooks, but it's still a relevant point that the article wants to point out. Worthwhile to note, I found this article by the Audio Publishers Association showing off some data. This is one of those examples where I think you need to be aware of who is putting out the statistics just to think critically of the information you're being presented with. But the Audio Publishers Association annual survey shows audiobook sales grow to $2.22 billion. It's a growing market. The important paragraph I want to point out from this, though, is that the Audio Publishers Association 2025 consumer survey conducted by Edison Research found 51% of Americans aged 18 and older have listened to an audiobook, and there is a notable increase in interest among non-listeners. 38% say they are interested, up from last year, and then those very interested have also increased. One of the key insights also shows that accessibility is a relevant factor, a key factor, but a relevant factor overall for how people consume books. If an audiobook is available on their preferred listening platform, 72% people say that that's an important thing for them from the study. As an aside, I need this number right here to drop down to 0, but that's a conversation for another time. One of the more important articles that I want to examine relating to this topic and the point I'm about to make is going to be Listening Ears or Reading Eyes, a meta-analysis of reading and listening comprehension comparisons by Virginia Clinton Lascelles, which was published in the Review of Educational Research. So for those that don't really know, a meta-analysis is basically one person looking at a bunch of different research across a bunch of different journals, disciplines, periods of time, and comparing, contrasting, putting together all that information and analyzing that. So it's not a direct experiment or direct study that they're commenting on. They're looking at a bunch of studies from a bunch of different people. I don't have access to the full article, but I think the abstract is pretty clear about what this author found. In the study, a meta-analysis of reading and listening comprehension comparisons across age groups was conducted. And of course, this meta-analysis discusses a lot of things and examines a lot of different principles, but the relevant thing for us in this discussion, she points out in the abstract, which is that she found, across the studies, the overall difference between reading and listening comprehension was not reliably different. So we'll keep that in mind. Now, of course, I save the best for last, the creme de la creme, the keystone for this whole entire video, especially when it comes to the research and what it has to say. So this article, the representation of semantic information across human cerebral cortex during listening versus reading is invariant to stimulus modality. What a mouthful. This study was published back in 2019 in the Journal of Neuroscience by Fatma Deniz, Anwar O. Nunez Elizalde, Alexander Huth, and Jack Gallant. This is such an interesting study because it basically examines how the brain actually responds to reading textual information versus listening to information. They actually did a whole study and examined what areas of the brain were active when listening versus reading. And you can kind of already see it here. Similar areas of the brain are active regardless of how you're receiving information. Here's another figure from that study. Here's another figure from that study. So this is a very important study to this conversation. I'm going to read their significance statement from this piece. Humans can comprehend the meaning of words from both spoken and written language. It is therefore important to understand the relationship between the brain representations of spoken or written text. Here, we show that although the representation of semantic information in the human brain is quite complex, these semantic representations evoked by listening versus reading are almost identical. These results suggest that the representation of language semantics is independent of the sensory modality through which the semantic information is received. So those are quite a few complicated words. Basically, what it's saying is that when we engage with words, whether they are symbols on a page that we have to decode, or whether it's audio that we listen to and digest and interpret the meaning of, similar areas of the brain are acting. And the brain is an incredibly complex part of the human body. I hope we all know that. But there is no significant difference between the brain interpreting words on a page versus the brain interpreting words that you're hearing. That's what all this semantic representation terminology means. Whether you read the word tree or hear the word tree, your brain is going to activate in specific areas, recalling what a tree is, so you can comprehend either what you're reading or what you're listening to. So in the end, I think the research speaks for itself. When it comes down to it, the people that listen to an audiobook comprehend it and use just as much of their brain as those who read a physical book. The same areas of the brain are working to comprehend what they're either reading with their eyes or listening to with their ears, meaning it is not an intellectually lazier way to consume books. Rolling with that premise, I still want to argue that there is a difference between the two. I still want to look at the differences between each method. So I'm going to start with talking about the benefits of actually picking up a book and reading it. Obviously, we can get behind certain sentimental aspects of it, certain nostalgic aspects of it. There's something to be said about physically picking up a book, but that's not really what I want to look at right now. What I want to look at is, what are you doing when you physically pick up a book and read? You are looking at text on a page, you are pulling that information into your brain, analyzing it, and making it make sense in your brain. You are phonetically sounding out words inside your mind. Sometimes you do it out loud, but you are phonetically sounding out the words that you might not know, drawing important context clues to figure out a word that you might not know in order to make it all make sense. Now, there's a quote I want to point out, and I'm going to read it verbatim. Decoding requires you to look at a set of print symbols and pair those symbols to a phonological representation of a word. You have to say the sounds in sequence in your head, or even sub-vocalize them so you can recognize what the word is. Also, another quote, you have to understand the meaning of the words, both individually and in the context of the sentence, paragraph, or entire message. When it comes to actually reading a book, you are the one that is scanning the page, going forward, moving through paragraphs, moving through the pages to consume the story, to understand what is going on. So whether it's fiction, nonfiction, you are having to engage with a work on your own terms. Your voice is what is speaking to you. Obviously, you can make little funny voices in your head for characters if you want, but it's still your mental voice reading what is on the page to you. You get to determine how people sound like. You get to make representations in your head about what a scene looks like. You get to fill in those gaps yourself. You don't have someone else filling in any gaps for you. You get to do all that yourself, which is a benefit to actually reading. And so there's something to be said about there is a benefit on a literacy level to understand what text actually means. Because if you don't know how a word sounds or what a word means, or you don't know how to spell it, you might not know what some of the words on the page mean. And that, I think, requires a different kind of intellect. It's like book smarts versus street smarts, right? You can know what a word means, but if you've never seen it written down, you're not gonna recognize it on a page. And especially when we talk about language, when we talk about comprehension, there is a difference between auditory comprehension of a language and textual comprehension of a language. Think about if you've ever tried to learn a second language, right? I've attempted to learn Spanish. I'm in process of boostering that knowledge, but also I'm learning Korean right now. So there's a difference between understanding auditorily what a word is versus understanding how it's written. And because English is a crazy language, phonetically, things don't always make sense. And phonetically, even words that are spelled similarly are going to sound different. The most simplistic example I can think of right now is read versus read. So I have a pretty good handle of reading Spanish, but the actual act of understanding it when I'm listening to it can get a little tricky. And that is still the case for a native language. So if we're talking about English, that is still the case. And a perfect example I want to give on this kind of divide is I was recently listening to the audiobook for R.F. Kuang's Catabasis. There was a point I was listening to it. I think I was on a walk around my neighborhood, and I was listening to it, and I encountered a word that I did not know. Context clues, I quickly figured out what it meant, but I did not know. And so I quickly pulled out my phone, pulled out my notes app, and I phonetically wrote down what I heard because I did not know how it was spelled. It's one of those potentially tricky words. Judge me all you want, I didn't know this word. But I'm gonna prove it. I'm gonna put up on the screen a screenshot from my notes app. That's what I wrote down. And then when I got home, because I was switching between reading the book and listening to the audiobook, I went and found where it was in the book, found that page, found the word, and realized how it was spelled. And so I'm making that connection between what the correct pronunciation of a word is versus how it is spelled versus its meaning. Or not versus, but in conjunction. How it's pronounced in conjunction with how it's spelled, in conjunction with its meaning. And the word was aphasic, aphasic, involving or exhibiting loss or impairment of the ability to use and comprehend words. Very relevant to this discussion, I think, that reading actually bolsters your ability to comprehend words, and I think that is a big benefit to it and why everybody should be incorporating physical reading into their regular lives. And I think especially in a time where we have such a literacy crisis in the United States of America, which I'll talk about that more in depth another time, I think. But we have a literacy crisis, and anybody in the service industry can tell you people don't know how to read. And I think we should be encouraging physical reading as much as possible, because if you go into a restaurant and you do not comprehend the words on a sign, that is a problem. That is a problem. And this all relates to our literacy crisis in America and how a vast majority of adults have below a 6th grade reading level. This is a problem, and it needs to be addressed at some point. It is a purposeful problem. It is a intentionally created problem. But let's be real. If more people actually read books, read words on a page, had that skill set, we'd be a lot better off. So we've talked about physically reading. Now we need to talk about listening to audiobooks and how that can be beneficial and what the difference is with that. I want to start with a question. How do we learn language as people? Do we pick up Moby Dick at 2 years old and scan through the pages and say, oh, I understand what that means? No, we are constantly hearing adults in our lives talk and use words and encourage us to use words. You learn language as children through your ears. You make connections on how a word sounds and what it means. You know, if a baby, after saying mama, is able to say milk, milk, they're not going to say, yeah, that's M-I-L-K. I understand that. No, they're going to be able to verbalize what they have heard. And again, like I was talking about with language earlier, an important component of learning languages is listening to it. You have to understand how a language sounds in order to learn it. That is why so many people comment on the easiest way to learn languages is through immersion. You're listening to it, you're engaged with it. If you force yourself into a new country and you have to pick up the new language, you're quickly going to do so if you're only encountering and hearing that language. So the act of listening to an audiobook is going to help engage your brain, obviously in the same way that reading comprehension would, but it is going to give you the ability to understand pronunciation and tone, how certain things are said, and that is going to help bolster your language comprehension overall. Using myself as an example again, although again with a secondary language, I'm pretty good at reading Spanish. I don't know how everything is pronounced, and so listening to Spanish helps bolster my comprehension of the language. While on the topic of children, there's also something to be said about families listening to audiobooks together, or families reading aloud a story, which kind of is the same concept of an audiobook. This is a way for children who are unable to comprehend words on a page to engage with stories, to learn throughout this experience. It's, again, a positive benefit and a reason audiobooks should be incorporated into learning and people's lives. If you have kids, put on an audiobook and listen to it all together. Also, it saves you the effort. You don't have to read an entire story to your kids. Listen to the audiobook together. And obviously, if we want to consume stories more often, oftentimes there are burdens in the way of being able to just sit down and read a physical book. Audiobooks obviously come in handy when you can just turn it on and listen to it while you're doing chores, while you're cleaning, while you're baking, while you're working out. Again, these are all examples of when I've listened to audiobooks as well. You are able to obviously multitask in different ways. As long as you are paying attention to the story, it is a benefit. You are realistically still consuming that story. Now, if you're daydreaming or dozing off or getting so distracted that you lose your sense of place in the story, then that's where I think you personally need to reflect on whether or not it's actually valuable to listen to audiobooks while doing other tasks. There have definitely been times where I've kind of started daydreaming while listening to an audiobook and I have to pause it and rewind a bit to go back and refresh where I am in the story and refocus my attention on the story that I'm listening to. But audiobooks in that context are a way to encourage reading. If you can do it while you are doing other labor, you are going to free up more of your time and be able to more effectively use some of your time. Another comment I want to make that I did not personally come to, but that I heard someone else say, is the difference between reading a book on your own and listening to an audiobook is that it is not just you and the words of the author having a conversation. It is you, the words from the author, and the audiobook narrator that are collectively coming together to create your experience with the book. An audiobook narrator could change how you experience the book. On a simplistic level, if you hate a narrator's voice, your opinion of the book might be affected, but how they tell the story, how engaging they are, it could affect your experience with the book, either positively or negatively. That's just something to consider, and there are definitely positive examples of that. And that's why I'm going to mention that here in the defense of audiobooks. Although that could also be a defensive position for physical reading, is that you don't have that extra voice in your mind influencing how you engage with the book. But it could be a positive. Now, I'm also not going to generalize, but there are instances in which people have said that they've read a book where they actually haven't. And this goes back to that idea of what is considered valid reading. Some people think audiobooks aren't valid reading. We've kind of disproven that. But I think everybody has encountered at least one reader or seen someone talk about a reader on TikTok or social media that has made comments like, I skip to the dialogue. Oh, I don't read descriptions, they're too boring. Sometimes I skip through the pages. And so these people are not reading parts of this book. And then you have people that are daydreaming and not paying attention while they're reading. Do we want to consider these people as actually having read the book? I think doing that stuff categorically should mean that you have not read a book. And therefore, if you are the type of person to say, oh, I'm skipping through the book, I'm only reading dialogue, your opinion on a book does not matter, should not matter, because you are not actually engaging with the material. It's the same thing as like putting on a movie when your Netflix and chill buddy comes over and y'all, have some fun while the movie's in the background and the movie ends. Are you going to say that you watched the movie? No, we would not consider that as someone having watched a movie. You're not paying attention to it. You can't have an opinion on it if you only caught the first part and then we're busy for the rest of the movie. So all that being said, this is another benefit of audiobooks. It's pretty hard to skip ahead in audiobooks. Sure, you can skip around, but you are going to be so confused. You can't specifically skip forward to dialogue. You can't skip through description. And so that's another positive of audiobooks, I guess, is compared to physical reading, it's harder to skip through. Now, for another point I want to make. So we can't view the breadth of this discussion until we are also considering how this might affect people with disabilities. Audiobooks can be immensely helpful for people with certain disabilities. Just thinking about people that are blind or that are vision impaired. Audiobooks are obviously going to be an effective way for them to engage with literature, to read stories. Again, colloquial use of that term. Are you going to look at them and say they're not valid in how they consume books because they listen to audiobooks? Those with dyslexia might find it easier to listen to an audiobook rather than struggle through the actual act of reading. Hell, even some people with ADHD might be benefited by listening to audiobooks. I know I have been. I sometimes find it difficult to focus and actually progress through a story depending on environmental factors or whatever. But listening to an audiobook has helped me finish a lot more books than I necessarily would have, especially in instances where I am switching between physically reading and listening to the audiobook, whether it's too boring or whether I just can't focus. And for those that obviously dislike audiobooks, I would like to say that people that might be deaf or are hard of hearing aren't going to necessarily engage with that in the same way. But for those people, if their idea is that people that listen to audiobooks are less intelligent than those that physically read, are we just going to say that people that are deaf or hard of hearing are somehow more intelligent than people that are blind? I don't think that's really an argument we want to get into. So again, an important caveat, people with disabilities can definitely engage with audiobooks and make use of them in positive ways. And there should be no moral attachment on the use of audiobooks if we incorporate this reasoning. So with all of this information coming together, looking at these different viewpoints, I think it's safe to say that the real difference is not between reading a book and listening to an audiobook, although they are different, that is still my point. But the real difference, the important difference, is going to be those that engage with what they're reading versus those that do not. The people that skip through it, that daydream while they're listening to an audiobook, that only read the dialogue when they're reading physical books, those people are not engaging with an author's work. Why should we listen to their opinions? Are they actually taking what they need to be taking from these experiences? These people that don't engage with literature versus whether they read it physically or listen to it on an audiobook are actively engaging and fully consuming the contents of a book. That, I think, is the core difference that people are bringing up and are mistakenly assigning it to this discussion between physical reading or listening to audiobooks. It's a mistaken association. I think the real problematic difference is between those that do not engage with works versus those that do. And at the end of the day, nothing really matters. Everybody's going to have their own opinions. We're all going to die one day when the sun explodes and the human race comes to an end. So none of this matters. We're just talking about it on the internet because we like being silly. And because we all have our own thoughts and opinions and views, and we should allow others to have their own thoughts and opinions and views. And as long as they are happy, they should be happy. And we need to do and focus on what makes us happy. So what makes you happy? Does reading physical books make you happy? Does listening to audiobooks make you happy? Do what makes you happy. Do what makes you happy, please. Focus less on being upset about what other people do with their lives and focus on what brings you joy, what makes you feel happy. Come on, this world is hard enough as it is. Spend less time hating on other people, hating on other things, and more time propping up what you enjoy, focusing on the things that you enjoy. But if we're being honest, my conclusion is obviously the objectively and only correct option, and everybody should live by what I think, and we're gonna just go with that, okay? Obviously. My conclusion with all this information, I think that the act of reading a physical book and the act of listening to an audiobook are both unique methods of consuming literature. Now, if you stuck around with me this long, though I say they are different, I think you have a better understanding of what I mean. They are unique methods of consuming a story, both with positive and negative potential impacts, and I personally think they're both great. They are different, and everybody should do both. Everybody should do both. That is my takeaway. That is my conclusion. You should read physical books every once in a while. You should give listening to audiobooks a try every once in a while. And I think, in a way, we have to relate this back to the literacy crisis in America. Both of them help address that crisis. The act of reading, the act of consuming literature with your eyes or with your ears, just is a positive impact either way. At the end of all this, hope you kind of see where I'm coming from and take all these considerations with you, formulate your own opinions, and do what makes you happy. And with that, sayonara, stay peachy. I've been saying that a lot. Otherwise, have a great day. Thank you for sticking around. And until next time, bye.